They were the sounds that heralded doom. The beating of monstrous wings overhead, the throaty growls that resonated like distant thunder. Winterfell's ramparts, once the proud stronghold of the north, lay in a half-dead hush. Every soul within its walls, soldier or servant, highborn or low, felt a cold that went beyond the harshest winter's bite. Stillness blanketed the courtyard, but it was the stillness of quavering anticipation, like the hush before a storm sweeps in to tear everything apart. Even those who'd fought in battles uncountable, who had looked into the eyes of whites and lived, found their breath hitching in their chests, hearts pounding against their ribs. The Night King had returned, and upon his approach, torches sputtered and died as if cowed by his presence. Winds lashed through the courtyard with an unnatural keening, a sense of the world itself going breathless, as the living and the dead prepared for a confrontation that might tear reality asunder. They'd thought him gone, or perhaps they had allowed themselves that hopeful lie. But nightmares have ways of worming back into waking hours, and this new terror had brought with it an even more astonishing horror. He came not alone this time, for seated before him, upon a saddle fashioned of black decaying leather and strung with horrifying trophies, was Daenerys Targaryen. No longer alive, no longer the breaker of chains or the mother of dragons. She had become his bride of ice and death. Her skin bore the pallor of a corpse, her once mortal eyes now an endless frozen blue. Her hair, still pale silver in color, was stiff as if touched by permanent frost, and the once fiery spirit that had lurked behind those violet eyes was now eclipsed by the unholy glow of the great other. She looked almost serene in her silent state, high upon the beast's back. Only the faintest flickers of her once human features remained, a suggestion of her high cheekbones and full mouth, though that mouth held no warmth now, and her cheeks were carved with a deathly hollowness. Yet it was not Daenerys alone who sowed devastation in the hearts of the living. Beneath them, bearing its new riders, was Drogon. The black-scaled dragon soared above Winterfell on wings as dark as a starless night, his once raging flame replaced by the same crackling, icy breath that spilled from the Night King's undead horde. His roar had changed to something bleak, a grating shriek that seemed to rend the clouds themselves. Where once he had breathed fire in swirling plumes of red and orange, now shards of ice erupted from his maw, swirling in an aura of freezing mists that crystallized the air. Frost rimed his obsidian scales. His eyes glowed with the same eerie, ensnared light as Daenerys, a twisted corruption of all the living force he used to embody. From Winterfell's battlements, Sansa Stark clutched at the cold stone crenellation in front of her, her knuckles white. She felt a violent trembling in her stomach, for it was not so long ago she had stood face to face with Daenerys. They had never been friends, but they had fought on the same side. They had once shared a mutual hope to protect the living from the certain doom of the White Walkers. And now, to witness her like this, an unholy puppet of ice, was a torment she could not measure. Close by, Arya stood with a grim expression. Her hand toyed with the hilt of the Valyrian steel dagger at her side, the same blade that had once undone the Night King. She had moved so swiftly in that ancient godswood to strike him down. She had ended the threat, or so they believed. Yet the man, if man he ever was, had come anew with a vengeance, and that vengeance now perched on a reanimated dragon's back. Below them in the courtyard, Jon Snow paced. He had arrived from the keep at a full sprint once the alarm rang out. Torches on the walls sputtered in the unnatural winds. Some sputtered and died in the presence of this cold. Jon's breath came in white tufts, his eyes wide as they took in the monstrous silhouette circling the skies. Once that figure had been as dear to him as any could be. Daenerys, lover, queen, ally. He had killed her in desperation after the burning of King's Landing. Such was one version of the tale, but in this new twist of events, she had been lost in another manner. She had joined the dead by the Night King's dark will. Jon felt as if his soul had been ripped from him twice over, that no corner of his heart could ever be free of guilt. He clenched the pommel of Longclaw. They had known some new horror was descending. They had glimpsed whites anew in the countryside, had heard word of wandering packs of the dead beyond the burned remains of the iron-born fleet near the coast. Whispers out of the gift told of vile shapes, seen in the moonlight, drifting south as though drawn to a malevolent star. And now here it was, the reason for those rumors. The Night King had resurrected an ancient dread, reanimated and enslaved Daenerys Targaryen. Jon's mind reeled at the cruelty. But he had no time for heartbreak or reflection. There was only the present moment, the sliver of time before the attack, and Winterfell's need for defense. He heard a scraping sound and turned. Ghost stood at his side, red eyes fixed upon the sky, a soundless snarl curling his muzzle. Even the direwolf sensed the approach of death upon wings. Jon laid a trembling hand between Ghost's ears, a fleeting attempt at solace. Then the watchers on the wall saw the glint of the Night King's spear raised high. Some giant horn or calling instrument gave a low rumbling note across the sky. No mortal horn, but an unnatural resonance that tore across the northern wind. In answer, the whites massed below. They had already gathered in the gloom just beyond arrow range, an immense throng of undead sweeping across the darkness like a frozen tide. Many were newly made, for the months after the long night's supposed end had left war-ravaged corpses for reanimation. And at the forefront were spectral forms of fallen knights, men who once defended the living, and behind them the monstrous shapes of giant whites, dead warhorses, and other abominations pieced together from the horrors of battle. All of Winterfell's strength had readied itself for a final stand. What remained of the northern banners fluttered in that icy wind. The Vale archers formed tight ranks along the battlements. The unsullied, those who had remained loyal to the cause of the living even after Daenerys' fall, stood in perfect formation in the courtyard, spears at the ready. Northmen with flayed leathers and patched armor gripped their swords, heartbreak flickering in many eyes as they recalled how they'd once rallied behind the Targaryen queen. Now they would face her as an agent of death. The monstrous wings descended. Drogon alighted upon the edge of Winterfell's outer gate with an earth-shaking impact. Stone cracked. Frost spread in spider-web filigrees across the towers. The Night King sat tall upon the dragon's neck, silent and inscrutable. Beside him, Daenerys looked beyond emotion, neither sorrowful nor vengeful, simply consumed by that glacial vacancy. She was a being of the eternal night now. Jon felt time slow, felt his life unravel in that single moment. The wind whipped. The stench of decay hammered at him, and he tried to imagine words, anything that might reach the part of her soul that still belonged to the living. But no words formed on his lips. A low moan arose from below as the white army began to move forward. Hundreds of them shuffled, sprinted, or galloped on skeletal horses, their open mouths moaning noxious air. The defenders knew well how best to dispatch such foes, but the numbers were staggering. A single arrow from the wall shot outward, aimed for the front ranks, and struck its target in the chest. The white hardly staggered. Another arrow soared and found an eye socket. That undead man collapsed at last, only to be trampled by the tide behind it. No roar of battle erupted, only that endless moaning, as though the entire host were a single creature driven by one cold mind. Sansa grimaced, steeled herself, then commanded the archers at the top of her voice. A volley of flaming arrows filled the sky, raining down upon the dead. Once dragonfire might have been their greatest weapon, but that weapon was turned against them now. Jon watched the arrows fall, some biting flesh and bone, some snuffed out in midair by gusts of unnatural cold. He wished that Bran, King Bran, were here to lend his mysterious powers of sight and warging, but the young king was leagues away, forging alliances in the Riverlands. Time had not allowed him to return to Winterfell in time, so the defenders were on their own. The first wave crashed into the stakes lining the defensive perimeter. The whites hurled themselves blindly against sharpened wooden pikes, bodies impaled, flailing, but those behind them pushed forward, piling up in a writhing, hissing mass. The defenders along the walls dropped barrels of pitch, igniting them with flaming arrows. Fire blossomed, creating a barrier of crackling orange. Whites shrieked as they burned, limbs thrashing, Yet some continued to climb, unstoppable, until the inferno reduced them to char. A swirl of black cinders rose into the dark sky. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the living might hold the walls. But overhead, a single sharp cry sliced through the tumult. Daenerys Targaryen, the undead queen, raised her hand. A spasm of uncertain memory twisted her features, as if something flickered behind those vacant eyes. Then she let forth an inhuman wail, a keening shriek that shattered the night's air. Drogon responded in kind. With a great snap of his wings, he lifted off from the broken edge of the gate, soared over the courtyard, and exhaled a blast of swirling icy breath. The flames below flickered and died, as though snuffed by a gargantuan gale. Soldiers scattered, diving for cover as the frigid storm hammered down upon them. Frost raced over the ground in fractal patterns, seizing men's limbs and slowing them. Armor turned to icy shells that weighed bodies down, leaving them prone to the clawing wights. Jon roared for the men to hold their ground. He rushed to the front line, long claws Valyrian steel shining under the moonlight. He beheaded one wight, then another, the sword's edge slicing through rotted necks with grim efficiency. Ghost leapt beside him, snapping at the throats of a pair of undead in battered northern leather. All around them, Unsullied fought in disciplined ranks, but the horrifying cold from Drogon's breath made each movement a test of will. Swords froze to men's hands. Shields cracked under the sudden temperature drop. Jon felt the cold gnaw at his bones in ways even the bitter northern nights never had. Above the chaos soared the Night King, silent and unyielding. Beside him, Daenerys turned her face toward the keep. There was no life in that look, only a chilling emptiness. High above the fray on the walls, Arya narrowed her eyes, her body coiled with predatory tension. She saw Daenerys' pale hand cling to the dragon's saddle as if in reassurance. It almost broke Arya's heart. Even from a distance, she could imagine how it once felt for the silver-haired queen to ride her beloved child of fire with pride and majesty. Now it was a black travesty, a husk of that bond. But Arya was done letting heartbreak rule her. She had a job. She placed a hand on the parapet and vaulted over the edge, dropping into a bank of snow some 10 feet below, rolling to absorb the impact. She had never been one to remain a passive observer when action could be taken. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, Tormund Giantsbane let out a feral bellow. His red beard bristled with frost. He slammed a great battle-axe into the skull of a reanimated wildling he might once have known, then yanked it free with a growl. "Fight, you dogs, fight!" he roared, rallying the scattered northerners. Davos Seaworth was there too, holding his ground with a trembling sword hand. He had never been the greatest fighter, but he was a man of unwavering loyalty, and that loyalty fueled his courage. Nearby, Gendry swung a heavy warhammer in destructive arcs, smashing wights into fragments of frozen bone. The swirl of ice overhead signaled Drogon's next pass. Jon yelled for the men to spread out. The defenders scattered, but too many were caught in the beast's glacial breath. Cries of agony peppered the courtyard as men froze where they stood. The wights, unaffected by the cold, surged forward to tear those half-frozen defenders apart. Jon's eyes flicked upward, hunting for a moment he might strike at the undead queen or the Night King. But they soared above the line of archers, out of reach. The memory of how Arya had killed the Night King made him yearn for some cunning approach that might replicate that success. But the advantage of surprise was gone. Now the enemy soared aloft on an undead dragon, commanding the field from above. Their only chance, perhaps, was to lure him down or get close enough with dragonglass spears or Valyrian steel. He remembered the crypts. He remembered how wights had been raised from within them once before. If the Night King's power was strong enough to conjure the ancient dead from Winterfell's own catacombs, what horrors might still be waiting? The thought chilled him more than the winter wind. A new dread began to crawl up his spine. He sprinted toward the ramp, leading up to the second level of the courtyard, cutting down a wight in passing, sidestepping another. Ghost flanked him loyally. Far overhead he glimpsed Daenerys' form leaning forward, her once beautiful face contorted. The creature that used to be Khaleesi hissed, raising her gaze to the sky as if channeling some unknown force. And as Jon watched, the clouds churned in response, swirling in a bruised dark spiral that crackled with strange bluish lightning. A shrill shout from the parapets turned his head. "They're in!" A section of the outer rampart had collapsed under Drogon's weight, and the whites were pouring in. Bodies upon bodies, gnashing and clawing, stepping over their own. The lines of defenders were forced to yield ground. Already, the courtyard was half overrun. Men struggled to hold a shield wall, but the ferocity and numbers of the dead threatened to tear that wall asunder. Jon took a desperate moment to search for a flash of red hair on the battlements. Sansa was still up there, arrow nocked in her bow, face grim, sending shaft after shaft into the throng. He wanted to shout for her to find shelter, but he knew better. She would not run, not unless there was no other choice. And Arya, he caught no glimpse of her. Knowing her, she was already somewhere in the shadows, hunting. Another crash of wings overhead. Jon felt the gust swirl around him. Atop Drogon, the Night King turned a cold, inhuman stare down on the living. The sapphire orbs of his gaze seemed to drink in every heartbeat, every flicker of mortal spirit. Daenerys remained at his side, an exquisite statue of death. Jon felt his heart stutter. A memory ignited. Daenerys smiling in a warm field, her hair blowing in the wind, her eyes shining with life as she spoke of building a new world. The memory was a blade in his chest. In her current form, the corners of her lips turned downward in an expression of silent malice. Her parted lips revealed a silent exhalation, and frost crystals formed in the air before her face. It was as if a cold mockery of the woman he had loved stared back at him, offering neither compassion nor hatred, only emptiness. In that moment, some impulse gripped him. Maybe it was love. Maybe madness. Maybe the memory of regrets never soothed. Jon roared her name as if she could still hear. Daenerys. The name echoed against the courtyard walls. The fighting paused in a curious ripple, as if even the dead recognized that name, that voice. One heartbeat passed, two. Daenerys slowly turned her head, looking directly at Jon. The bleakness in her eyes was absolute. No spark of recognition, no sign of a soul peering from within. The chilling breath hissed between her pale lips, and Drogon circled lower. Jon raised Longclaw, point aimed at them. His voice cracked with anguish. "Dany, if any part of you remains, stop this." But the words fell on an unfeeling shell. The Night King's stare flickered between Jon and the Queen at his side, as if sharing some silent cosmic joke. Then he gently guided Drogon into a dive. The black wings folding, the monstrous beast descending to unleash another wave of icy fury upon the defenders. A shattering impact rocked the courtyard as Drogon's tail struck the battlement wall, toppling part of it in a thunderous cascade of rock. Cries erupted from soldiers crushed beneath the debris. Sansa lost her footing, sliding across the upper rampart, nearly plunging into the courtyard below. She grabbed a broken stone ledge, arms shaking. A burly northern soldier lunged forward to help her back to safety before returning to the fight. While this carnage unfolded, a shadow slithered through the chaos. Swift, graceful, unseen. Arya Stark darted among the swirling battle, stepping between whites with lethal precision. She used the confusion of the living and the dead, locked in struggle to cloak her movement. Her eyes were locked on the Night King and Daenerys. A cat, stalking a monstrous bird of prey. She clutched a short spear fashioned of dragon glass, reminiscent of the weapon Gendry once forged for her. She knew the one advantage she might have: stealth. The Night King had once underestimated her agility and cunning. If she could get close enough again, if she could manage to slip behind him or even Daenerys, she might strike a blow that ended this horror. Or at least end one of them. She didn't know what killing Daenerys would do. Would it free Drogon? Would it sever the Night King's hold? Or was the Queen merely another white in his army, her death meaningless beyond heartbreak? The fear of not knowing knotted in Arya's gut, but she pressed on. She had always known how to pick the right moment, to trust her instincts in the storm. She dashed behind a lumbering white of a giant, bounding over a collapsed ballista cart. She sprinted beneath a dripping arch, then vaulted upward, grabbing hold of a hanging lantern bracket. She pulled herself to a narrow ledge that circled a tower. The vantage point let her see the swirling whiteness of Drogon's back and the two figures astride it. The living had no time to shoot him down or launch any more elaborate plans. The lines were in disarray. The only chance was a kill stroke, a single blow where it mattered. Drogon alighted again, near the wrecked corner of the courtyard. His claws gouged deep ruts in the stone. The Night King surveyed the carnage, and it seemed as if he took a moment to relish the terror he had unleashed. Daenerys, at his side, hissed in a low, feral note. It occurred to Arya that the queen was not entirely mindless. Her posture was too deliberate, her eyes too intent. The Night King had shaped her into something more than a wight, an abomination with enough cunning to direct the full power of a dragon. She was a reflection of what once was, and what now stood in direct opposition to all living souls. Silently, Arya took a measured breath. She stepped to the edge of the tower's ledge, balanced like a dancer, eyes fixed on the gap between her vantage point and Drogon's flank. It was a perilous jump, especially with the swirling winds that battered the tower. But she saw no other way. If she could land on Drogon's back, or at least close enough to grab hold, she might reach the Night King. Her entire body tensed, coiling. She steadied the dragonglass spear, took one last breath to still her pounding heart. Her father's voice surfaced in her mind. Fear cuts deeper than swords. Let fear pass through you. She vaulted off the tower. The wind rushed around her body. The courtyard below was a pit of screaming men and shrieking wights, blood and carnage. Above, the flapping wings of an undead dragon, the monstrous shape so close, yet still far. For one infinite second, Arya seemed weightless, suspended in the swirling night. Then she crashed onto Drogon's flank, arms scrabbling at an icy ridge of scale that threatened to tear the flesh of her palms. A wild cry tore from her lungs, whether triumph or horror, she couldn't tell. The impact rattled her bones, nearly dislodging the dragonglass spear. She clung with all her might, hooking a leg under another jagged scale. Drogon shifted violently in surprise, or possibly in pain. His entire form shuddered. From his vantage, the Night King felt the jolt. Slowly, he turned. Arya had not the element of surprise she once had in the Godswood. Daenerys wheeled around as well, her unnaturally blue gaze alighting on the new presence. Arya gritted her teeth against the bitter cold emanating from the scaly hide. She tried to push herself upward, but Drogon's thrashing was too intense. She could barely maintain her hold. The dragonglass spear threatened to slip from her hand. She realized with dread that if she lost it, her chance to do real harm was gone. In that instant of precarious balance, she caught Daenerys' eyes. For a heartbeat, the undead queen seemed to waver. Was it recognition? A memory of life? Arya would never know. It was as if Daenerys' face was carved from ice, and only the faint flicker of pain or conflict passed across it. Then her lips parted, and a furious hiss emerged, an animalistic challenge. Arya hissed in return, forcing her muscles to strain as she began crawling along Drogon's flank. She tried to swing a leg over his spine, but the dragon pitched wildly, nearly dislodging her. The courtyard was a dizzying swirl beneath her. With a surge of fear-driven determination, she found purchase on a spike of bone jutting from the base of Drogon's neck. She hauled herself up, gasping, arms on fire. She was close now, perhaps 8 or 10 feet behind where Daenerys sat. A line of decaying harness straps flapped in the wind. She reached for one, but the Night King gave no quarter. He lifted his spear, a weapon forged of ice, shimmering with unnatural power. He thrust it backward, targeting Arya in a blur of movement. She tried to twist aside, but the cramped position on Drogon's back offered little room to dodge. The spear caught her along the ribs, slicing through her leathers, sending a wave of biting cold across her torso. She felt a ripping pain, warm blood trickling under her clothes. But she managed to twist enough so that the strike wasn't fatal. She clenched her teeth, refusing to cry out. Weakness threatened to seize her limbs. The cold, emanating from that wound, was more than physical. A sense of dread and numbness pooled in her chest, sapping her strength. But she pressed forward, letting go of all illusions of caution. She lurched another foot closer, spear in her right hand. Daenerys snarled, leaning to strike at Arya with an outstretched hand. Black nails, elongated and sharp as knives, raked at Arya's face. Arya jerked her head to the side. She felt the queen's claws tear a bloody line across her cheek. Pain flared, but a lifetime of training took over. She reached for the wrist and tried to pivot the arm, hoping to unbalance the undead queen. Daenerys' strength was monstrous. She barely budged. Drogon roared, twisting in place. The courtyard's chaos reeled around them. Jon had noticed Arya's precarious climb by now. He stood near a cluster of Northmen, eyes wide with both terror and hope, as he realized what she was attempting. Sansa, from the battered wall, had spotted her as well, drawing in a gasp, hands pressed to her mouth, forgetting for a moment to command the archers. Even the Whites paused in their assault, as if the psychic link connecting them to the Night King had momentarily diverted. The Night King lifted his spear once more, aiming for a clear, decisive thrust. Arya locked eyes with him. Those cold, implacable eyes that once shattered when she plunged Valyrian steel into his side. This time, though, he seemed prepared. She tightened her grip on her own weapon. Time slowed to a glacial crawl. Before the spear could pierce her, Drogon suddenly lurched. A dragonglass-tipped ballista bolt, launched from somewhere along the ramparts, grazed the dragon's flank. It was not a direct hit, but it was enough to sting him, enough to draw his attention. He twisted, bellowing, swiping his tail across the courtyard and shattering a stone arch. The jarring motion threw the Night King slightly off balance. In that split second, Arya threw herself forward, the dragonglass spear aimed directly at Daenerys' chest. Daenerys tried to snatch the spear mid-thrust. Her icy, clawed fingers closed around the haft. For an instant, both women strained, locked in a deadly test of power. Arya felt the savage cold draining her, her arms quivering. With a desperate cry, she twisted her body, dislodging the spear from Daenerys' grip just enough to drive it home, plunging its tip into the flesh over Daenerys' heart. A shriek tore through the air, so piercing it seemed to resonate in every stone of Winterfell. Arya felt a wave of blistering cold erupt around the spear shaft, a shock wave that hurled her from Drogon's back. She tumbled through frigid air, glimpsing the courtyard spinning beneath her. She braced for impact. She crashed onto a slanted section of collapsed roof, her body slamming into wood and stone. The breath was ripped from her lungs. Pain consumed her senses, but her consciousness hung on by a thread. Far above, Daenerys' shriek continued, an unholy keening that shattered hearts and minds alike. The entire courtyard seemed to vibrate. Whites staggered, some collapsing as if the link controlling them wavered. Drogon reared back, flailing, smashing the remnants of a tower with his wings. The Night King struggled to keep his seat. Arya blinked through a haze of agony, uncertain if she had truly wounded Daenerys, or if it was all for naught. She coughed, tasting blood, unable to move more than a few inches. Perhaps she had broken a rib, or several. On the ground, Jon Snow saw his chance. He shouted for the men to charge, leading a renewed assault against the disoriented Whites. Ghost bounded at his side, snapping through any undead in reach. The swirling confusion had thrown the enemy into momentary disarray. Jon sprinted toward the fallen section of the wall where Arya had landed. He wanted to protect her, or at least confirm she was still alive. Several Whites lurched to intercept him, but he slashed through them, the glow of Longclaw's steel flickering with each strike. Drogon howled, the shriek turning guttural. The spear still jutted from Daenerys' chest, black blood, if it could be called blood, oozing around it. Frost caked the wound. Her face contorted in a grimace of mingled agony and hatred. Atop Drogon, the Night King's expression flared with something like surprise or even fury. He reached to pull the spear free, but Daenerys grabbed his arm, resisting. Perhaps it was the last shred of her own will, or perhaps an involuntary spasm. The Night King snarled in frustration, wrestling with her for a moment as Drogon's massive body twisted in pain and confusion. That's when Tyrion Lannister, standing on a battered walkway behind the courtyard, caught a glimpse of opportunity. He'd been there, unarmed but for a dagger at his belt, barking commands for the living to hold formation. Now, observing the Night King's fleeting vulnerability, He waved frantically for the archers to focus every arrow on the undead dragon riders. Arrows streaked upward, though the swirling winds carried some astray. A few struck Drogon's frozen hide, snapping against the unholy scales. One arrow found Daenerys' shoulder, another embedded in her thigh. She did not flinch. The torment was unimaginable, and yet the undead queen felt no mortal pain. Her shriek was that of a being in spiritual anguish, not bodily. Jon scrambled up a collapsed portion of the courtyard steps, trying to reach Arya. He finally saw her half buried under rubble from a collapsed roof, blood staining her leathers. He pulled the stones away with frantic hands until he freed her. She let out a low, ragged moan, eyelids fluttering. Relief nearly overwhelmed him. With Devos' help, Jon hoisted Arya's limp form onto his shoulder, carrying her behind the partial shelter of a toppled wagon. She was alive, but needed a maester immediately. Overhead, the Night King tore the spear from Daenerys' chest with a savage pull. The wound hissed, cold mist billowing forth. It looked unnatural, an injury not of flesh but of living ice. Daenerys pitched forward, eyes wide with that eerie glow. A faint vestige of her old self drowned beneath the swirling necromancy. The Night King let the spear fall from his grasp. It tumbled into the courtyard and shattered like glass upon impact. Yet Daenerys did not fall from Drogon's back. She remained seated, but her posture slumped, her head bowed. The Night King grasped her by the shoulder, pulling her upright, as if refusing to let this weapon be taken from him. Their bodies radiated a cold so intense that the air around them shimmered in a pale nimbus. For a moment, the defenders dared to hope that the blow had been fatal, that the queen might topple and free Drogon from her thrall. But with a faint shift, Daenerys lifted her chin. The wound in her chest poured a thin black ichor. She blinked once, and though her eyes were still that same frozen blue, something else flared there, a swirl of turmoil. A long, unearthly sigh escaped her lips, more like a gust of wind than a human breath. Seeing her still upright, the living braced for more carnage. Drogon opened his jaws as if to unleash another torrent of frost. But the spasm of pain forced him to close them again with a roar of frustration. The Night King's hold on Daenerys and her dragon might have wavered, but it wasn't yet broken. The whites at ground level recovered some of their dreadful coordination. They converged again, pushing back the living. Tormund howled in rage, trying to hold a flank against the tide. Gendry swung his hammer, smashing skulls, but he was tiring. Sansa directed arrow fire from the ramparts, teeth chattering from the unholy cold. Tyrion wiped sweat and ice from his brow, eyes scanning for any sign of a final advantage. The defenders were scattered, battered, outnumbered. Would the respite from Arya's wound to Daenerys be enough? Then a new noise rippled across the battlefield. A horn, deep and powerful, sounding from the west. Heads turned. Across the snowy fields leading toward the Wolf's Wood, a fresh force appeared. Flags bearing the sigil of the Golden Kraken, and, unbelievably, the sigil of House Stark. Something had changed. Yara Greyjoy, perhaps, who had once pledged her ships to Daenerys, but then allied with the North after the Queen's downfall, had arrived with a detachment of Ironborn. Alongside them were small pockets of Northmen and some of the wildling survivors who had not been present at the initial assault. They crashed into the flank of the undead ranks, providing a sudden bulwark. Hope flared anew among Winterfell's defenders. Jon quickly turned from Arya, who was now in the care of a few loyal men attempting rudimentary first aid. "Hold on," he whispered, brushing her bloodied hair back from her brow, then seizing Longclaw. If there was a chance to tip the balance while the Night King's control wavered, he had to seize it. The final confrontation was at hand. He advanced through the battlefield, cutting down whites, forging a path toward the swirling black shape of Drogon. He shouted over the din, calling on those who could still fight to converge. A handful of Unsullied closed in, Grey Worm among them, his eyes fierce and unblinking. Brienne of Tarth, battered and spattered with blood, broke through a knot of whites to join them. Podrick limped in behind her, sword in hand. Together, they formed a wedge. The Night King must have seen them coming. He guided Drogon to pivot around, massive tail sweeping aside the wreckage. The courtyard was a broken ruin of flame, ice, and corpses. Snow fell in thick sheets, and the swirling lightning above cast flickers of blue light on the fortress walls. Upon Drogon's black scales, Daenerys sat slumped, her expression caught between tortured rage and a dead-eyed calm. Some part of her was locked in silent conflict. The Night King raised his hand. A crackle of blue energy arced between his fingers, coalescing into another lethal ice spear. He hurled it, a flicker of killing frost in the night. Jon lunged aside, diving behind a shattered ballista. The spear grazed the metal plating with a deafening crash, exploding into shards that peppered the ground with razor-sharp fragments. One shard nicked Brienne's forearm. She grit her teeth, ignoring the pain. Grey Worm advanced, launching his spear at Drogon's exposed belly, but it bounced off the dragon's scaled hide. Another soldier tried to stab the undead beast's hind leg, only to be swatted away by a single lash of Drogon's tail. The Night King's gaze swept over them, unperturbed. He urged Drogon upward, seeking a vantage from which to unleash another wave of frost. But as Drogon gathered his legs beneath him, Daenerys, reacting to some hidden thread of her own will, lunged sideways and grabbed the harness straps. The movement caused Drogon to jerk, effectively stopping him from taking off. The Night King whipped his head around, confusion evident in his chilling stare. Daenerys hissed at him, a rasping, guttural protest. For the first time, she seemed at odds with her own master. Jon saw the opening. He sprinted forward, heart hammering. If Daenerys was fighting the Night King's control, even for a moment, it might allow them to strike. "Now!" he yelled. Those at his side rushed to the dragon's flank, aiming to cripple the beast's wings or hamper its movement. Jon set his sights on climbing to where the Night King perched. But in that moment of desperation, the Night King reasserted his dominion. He seized Daenerys' wrist, his touch blossoming with an icy aura that crackled across her entire form. She screamed, the sound shifting from tortured defiance to a new and terrifying note, as if that last ember of her own soul was being extinguished. The black ichor in her chest wound froze over, turning her flesh a glacial white around the spear's entry point. Her eyes blazed with fresh malevolence. The swirl of confusion in her gaze vanished, replaced by a predatory focus. With a single gesture, the Night King directed Drogon's head downward. The monstrous jaws opened, revealing swirling currents of frigid air. A foreboding hush fell upon the courtyard. Soldiers stumbled back, some dropping weapons in terror, knowing what was coming. Jon threw himself behind a chunk of fallen wall, bracing for impact. The freezing blast that erupted from Drogon's throat could shatter a fortress. It rolled across the courtyard in a wave of hoarfrost and lethal shards. Screams emerged and then were snuffed, bodies encased in ice. The ancient stone of Winterfell's walls groaned, cracks skittering along its surface. Fires that had been lit for defense snuffed out in an instant. An entire swath of the courtyard was transformed into a frozen wasteland. Brienne barely managed to dive behind a toppled statue, the edges of her cloak turning stiff with frost. Podrick cried out as shards lashed his arm. Grey Worm, further away, narrowly survived, pressing himself flat behind a collapsed cart. Those caught directly in the path died instantly, their faces twisted into silent masks of ice. When the breath subsided, the courtyard lay half-buried under a thick layer of frost and shattered ice. The living who had not been killed shuddered, struggling to regain their footing in the rubble. The whites pressed in once more, unstoppable, in the bitter cold. It seemed an apocalypse realized. Winterfell, that ancient seat of the Starks, battered and broken by a winter that refused to die. Yet somehow, Jon Snow had avoided the full brunt of the blast. He rose from behind the broken wall, the leather of his jacket crusted white, his hair coated in frost. He shuddered violently, but he still gripped Longclaw. His face reflected pure determination, marred by sorrow and a growing acceptance that this might be his final stand. He spotted the Night King, still astride Drogon, and locked eyes with him. No words were exchanged, but Jon felt the old power between them, life and death, a fated enmity that transcended speech. The Night King lifted another spear of ice, calmly taking aim at Jon. Time slowed. Then an unexpected flash of movement. Daenerys, still riddled with that dragonglass wound, seized the Night King's arm a second time, spoiling his aim. The spear's tip jolted upward. The ice missile flew wide, striking the top of the granary tower instead. A cascade of frosted stone rained down from above. Jon realized with a start that Daenerys was resisting, truly resisting. Whether it was conscious or reflex, something within her refused to let the final blow land on Jon Snow. The Night King turned on her with silent fury. The two locked in a macabre tableau, as though they were lovers entwined in a dance of torment. She hissed, her face twisted with a combination of anguish and defiance. He bared his teeth, that chilling expression of wrath. Tendrils of ice pulsed from his hand into her body. She convulsed, jaws open in a silent scream. Jon saw his moment. He forced numb legs to run, crossing the open courtyard with reckless abandon. Whites spotted him, but he cut them down, or Tormund, who emerged from behind a shattered wagon, took them out with his axe. Together they reached the battered flank of Drogon. Ice crystals shimmered over the dragon's obsidian scales, but at close range the beast's stench of decay was overwhelming. Jon blinked back tears as he recalled the times he had stroked Drogon's neck, felt the living warmth of the dragon's breath. Now it was all a nightmare reflection of that. He sheathed Longclaw momentarily, risking everything to grab hold of a broken harness strapped by Dead. Tormund kept the whites at bay for a few precious seconds, while Jon climbed. His fingers felt stiff as iron, the cold sapping all feeling from them. He prayed the grip would hold. Slowly, laboriously, he hauled himself upward, boots scraping for purchase on Drogon's shifting flank. The memory of Rhaegal's flight flickered in his mind, how he had once soared with Daenerys in the skies. Now he fought for every inch in this frozen hell. Above, the Night King was poised to deliver some final, lethal magic to Daenerys, presumably to remove her autonomy once and for all. She convulsed with each pulse of ice. Jon reached a tear in Drogon's saddle harness and dragged himself onto the beast's broad back, gasping in near delirium. He fumbled for Longclaw. The Night King turned, noticing Jon's presence. With a low snarl, he released Daenerys, leaving her slumped and thrust his hand toward Jon. A blast of bitter frost crackled forth, swirling into a narrow vortex of icy shards. Jon raised Longclaw, trying to block it. The sword's Valyrian steel did not shatter, but the cold hammered into Jon's chest. He felt his lungs burn with the shock, but he struggled onward, pushing through that bone-deep chill. His lips were turning blue. He bared his teeth against the agony, forging a final step forward. The Night King summoned his ice spear once more, brandishing it like a scythe. Jon ducked the first swipe, hearing it whistle past his ear. He lunged with Longclaw, aiming for the Night King's torso. But the ancient foe twisted with inhuman speed, deflecting the blow with an arm that seemed made of solid ice. Jon's sword bit in, slicing a shallow groove. Wisps of icy vapor escaped the wound. The Night King hissed, pale lips curling. He thrust the spear at Jon's midsection. Jon barely parried in time. The clash sent vibrations through his arms. They balanced precariously atop Drogon's back, the dragon swaying beneath them. The dead queen was slumped forward, eyes fluttering, black blood pooling on the scaly saddle. Below, the courtyard boiled with conflict. The living, buoyed by the new arrivals, fought desperately to keep the whites from overwhelming them. Snow whipped in fierce gusts around them, stinging eyes and skin. Jon snarled, pressing the attack. He swung again, aiming for the Night King's neck, but the spear came up and locked with Longclaw in a jarring clash. Frozen cracks raced along the steel of the spear. The Night King's expression remained a mask of cruelty. He shoved Jon back, sending him sliding across Drogon's hide. Jon flailed, nearly toppling over the side. But then, a rasping whisper cut through the wind. "Jon!" It was Daenerys's voice. Soft, strained, barely more than a memory of a voice. He turned his head, tears freezing on his cheeks. She reached out with a trembling hand. The wound in her chest flared with that black ichor, half frozen, half liquid. Her eyes flickered between that terrible blue and a fleeting shade of violet, as though her human soul were fighting for a final breath. "Jon," she repeated, an echo that might have been sorrow or a warning. The Night King hissed in renewed fury. He raised the spear high, intending to impale Daenerys right then and there, to punish this betrayal. But Jon, fueled by a desperate surge of protectiveness, launched himself forward and drove Longclaw through the Night King's side with all the strength he had left. The blade sank deep, biting into that core of frost and darkness. The Night King's eyes widened. A shriek tore from him, more alien and horrific than any mortal cry. Blue lightning crackled across his form, and for a moment it seemed the entire sky echoed his scream. But the shriek was answered by Daenerys. Some final ember within her recognized the advantage. She summoned what remained of her Targaryen fury, turning her body to cling to the Night King's arm, holding him in place so Jon could push the sword deeper. A swirl of frost exploded around them, so cold it felt like 1,000 needles piercing every bit of exposed flesh. Jon roared in pain, driving the blade until the hilt met icy flesh. The Night King jerked violently, twisting as though to rip free, but Daenerys clung like a wraith, her eyes brimming with an unearthly rage. Cracks formed along the Night King's torso, spiderwebbing out from the embedded Valyrian steel. He thrashed, the swirl of magic intensifying, but his control was slipping. Far below, the whites froze in mid-combat, their limbs going slack. Some collapsed instantly, as if the reanimation had been severed. Others staggered blindly. The living, battered and bloodied, stared in stunned awe as the tide of death halted. Up on Drogon's back, the Night King let out one more abhorrent shriek. The cracks spidered up his neck, over his face. Jon grimaced, feeling his own life slipping away in the cold, but he refused to yield. Then, in a shattering wave of ice, the Night King burst into fragments that scattered on the wind. A final wail of dark magic rippled out, blowing the swirling snow outward in a ring. Silence fell, the skies empty of that spectral presence. Daenerys gave a gasp, her body trembling as pieces of the Night King's essence crackled over her skin. For a heartbeat, it seemed she might revert to life, the black ichor receding. Jon reached for her, arms shaking, calling her name. But the wound in her chest still festered with dark power, the dragonglass lost in the swirl of arcane energies. She sagged in the saddle, the eerie blue of undeath flickering across her eyes once more, interspersed with a fleeting hint of her original violet. Drogon let out a mournful moan, his body lurching. Freed from the Night King's direct control, yet still half undead, the dragon convulsed under them. Jon barely managed to keep his hold. He clutched Daenerys, trying to keep her upright. She choked, a harsh rattle in her throat. The flesh around the chest wound seemed to crack apart, letting out curls of black mist. Jon realized in horror that she was falling apart, her undead form unraveling without the Night King's will to sustain it. He cupped her face, voice shaking. "Dany, don't leave, please." For a moment, something akin to a tear glistened in her eye, though it was a shard of ice. Her lips parted. No words came, only a trembling breath. Then her head fell back, the final trace of color fading from her eyes, leaving them clouded white. Her body slumped in his arms, unnaturally cold and rigid. That once passionate heart was stilled forever. Jon felt as though his own heart had been wrenched from his chest. Drogon roared a final time, a sound rife with loss, even in his undead state. The massive beast collapsed, wings draping over the broken battlements. Jon scrambled off, clutching Daenerys' corpse to his chest, tears freezing on his cheeks. He made it down onto solid ground just as Drogon gave one last rattling breath, then lay still. The black scales lost their luster, turning dull and brittle, as if the flames of life that once fueled him were truly extinguished. Silence blanketed Winterfell. The whites, now lifeless husks, littered the courtyard. The bitter wind still howled, but no unnatural frost came with it. The swirling clouds overhead parted slightly, letting a weak moonlight spill across the snow. The living, dazed survivors all took their first unsteady steps in a world free of the Night King's shadow. Many fell to their knees, either in relief or in grief for the friends lost. Tormund let out a loud, ragged exhale. Sansa, perched amid the ruined battlements, sank down, tears streaming freely. Tyrion, exhausted beyond measure, collapsed onto a broken stone, staring at the monstrous corpse of Drogon with haunted eyes. Jon knelt in the snow, Daenerys' body in his arms. The weight of what he had done, of what had been lost, pressed on him like a mountain. He bowed his head over her still face, brushing a strand of silver hair away from her brow. Her skin was cold as marble, her expression serene now that the torment was gone. He closed his eyes, recalling all the times she had spoken of breaking the wheel, of setting the world free. She had come to Westeros a conqueror, but she had also come a savior for a time. The tragedy that befell her felt immeasurable. In that hush, footsteps approached. Arya thought. She staggered, clutching her side, a makeshift bandage pressed against her wound. Despite her pain, she lowered herself beside Jon, gazing at Daenerys' ashen face with unreadable eyes. "Is it over?" she rasped. Jon nodded, voice a broken whisper. "Yes, the Night King is gone." He swallowed, holding Daenerys tighter, grief choking him. "And so is she." Arya took a shuddering breath. She looked at the frost-bitten corpses of the Unsullied, the shattered remains of the Whites. She blinked tears away. "We'll need to see to the wounded," she said, her practical mind surfacing even in heartbreak. "The living need us now." Jon didn't respond at first. He laid Daenerys gently upon a patch of snow, smoothing her ragged cloak. He stared at the moonlit sky, feeling like his soul had been torn in two. Yet Arya was right. The living needed them. And Daenerys, he brushed his hand over her still chest, deserved a farewell worthy of the Dragon Queen she had once been. With a trembling exhale, Jon rose. He offered Arya a supporting arm. She accepted it, leaning on him. Together, they surveyed the ravaged courtyard, the broken walls. This had been the site of the living's final stand. This, the heart of House Stark, reduced to a ruin of ice and death. Yet within that ruin, survivors still drew breath. Hope, fragile though it was, remained. The night sky began to clear. The stars emerged, solemn witnesses to the grievous cost of the final victory. Each star flickered like a candle flame, a beacon to guide those who remained through the darkness. And in that silence, with a hush that felt almost reverent, the dawn began to edge over the horizon, faint and cold, but there nonetheless, reminding all that while winter might come, life perseveres, no matter how bitter the cost. They would bury their dead, rebuild their homes, and remember the taste of this sacrifice. For the North endured, and the living went on, carrying the memory of the Dragon Queen who flew too close to an icy night, and the King of Death who fell at last under the unyielding steel of the free. And though the tears they shed turned to frost in the winter air, they pressed forward into the uncertain morning, determined to forge a new beginning from the ashes and the ice. Jon Snow knelt on Winterfell's battered courtyard, with Daenerys' cold body draped across his lap, her silvery hair clinging to the blood and frost that patterned his own clothing. The hush that followed the Night King's destruction felt greater than any silence Jon had ever known, a profound, echoing absence where the swirl of magic had once been. The dawn's first pale light made the broken towers and walls of the castle shimmer with a gentle, fleeting beauty, as though the ruin itself were softened by the momentary peace. He could still smell the ozone of that arcane storm. He could taste the bitter, metallic tang of his own blood on his lips. His limbs shook from the fight, the cold, and the shock of what he had just done. He stared into Daenerys' face. Her features were rigid in death, the flesh beneath his trembling fingers neither warm nor pliant. He touched her cheek as though to wake her, but there was no response, only the empty vessel left behind by the monstrous necromancy that had bound her. The last flicker of her will had helped him drive his sword through the Night King, yet it had not been enough to save her. In that final moment, some part of her soul had emerged, only to vanish again. Around them, survivors began to reorient themselves in the silver-blue hush. A few coughed in the frigid air. Some cursed or wept. Others sank to their knees, staring in numb disbelief at the remains of fallen friends and foes alike. Over half the soldiers who'd stood in Winterfell's defense lay dead in the courtyard, some with limbs twisted at unnatural angles, others frozen into macabre statues. Among them, stony lumps of whites and brittle fragments of ice testified to the abrupt severing of the Night King's magic. Here and there, pockets of movement showed where living fighters still huddled, rummaging for survivors or stripping corpses of weapons to fend off any last stragglers. Yet the whites had collapsed, inert once more, and those that had been reanimated animals or giant hulks now lay splayed as if carved from half-rotten wood. Tormund Giantspan emerged from behind a rubble pile. His broad shoulders heaved with each breath. Frost and splatters of blood streaked his red beard. He paused when he caught sight of Jon and the body in his arms. He trudged closer with slow, careful steps, as though every joint ached. His voice, usually so loud, came out in a hushed rasp. "Jon, are you hurt?" His gaze flicked warily to Daenerys, then back to Jon's face. Tormund recognized the finality of her stillness. Jon's eyes remained fixed on Daenerys. He gently lowered her onto the ground, smoothing out the tattered cloak bunched around her shoulders. "I'll live," Jon said, though he felt anything but alive. "Help those who need it. Get the wounded out of this cold." His voice was worn, barely audible. Tormund nodded, uncertain, and left with a great sigh. Jon heard his friend shouting directions a moment later, rousing others to gather the injured behind intact walls. The outer battlements were nearly collapsed, but some corners of the courtyard still provided shelter from the wind. A grim hustle began as men and women in blood-stained cloaks dragged their wounded friends out of the open or picked their way among the newly inert whites, making sure none rose again. Arya staggered forward. Though in dire pain, she was refusing to let anyone carry her. She cradled her left side, where the Night King's spear had sliced her. Jon noticed the blood-stained bandage pressed against her ribs. The wound had to be severe. Her face was pale, her lips tight as she fought to stay upright. Yet she soldiered on, determined, her footsteps crunching over frost-slick stone. When she reached Jon, she sank down onto one knee with a barely stifled groan. "She's gone," Arya said quietly, pressing her free hand gently to Daenerys' shoulder, as if verifying the reality of this final loss. Arya's features were a swirl of emotions: pity, anger, confusion, and exhaustion. "We have to get you inside too, Jon. Winterfell's half in ruins, but it's safer than here in the open." Jon exhaled. A swirl of white vapor came from his lips, lingering in the cold. "Died? I can't leave her like this," he said, voice tight. He reached out and brushed a patch of frozen hair from Daenerys' face. How cruel it felt that her story should end here, in an icy courtyard she'd once burned her life to save. The final memories of her living face were lost behind the haunting mask she wore in an unsheath. Arya bowed her head in acknowledgement. "We'll bring her in. But you're freezing, Jon. There's no sense in dying beside her body." She tried to stand, bracing an elbow against the ground, but pain wrenched her features. She grit her teeth in frustration. "Damn that spear," she muttered. "I need a maester's help." "Just hold still," Jon said quietly, though his own arms trembled with cold and grief. He lifted Daenerys' body once more, cradling her with awkward care, then extended his other arm to wrap around Arya's waist. "Lean on me." With a grunt, he pushed himself upright, supporting both his sister and the fallen queen. Each step felt like a mile. They picked their way through the carnage, passing scattered lumps of the dead. In the dim morning, everything looked colorless, as though the entire courtyard had been painted in shades of gray. At times, Jon's footing nearly slipped on the ice-glazed stones, but he set his jaw and pressed on. At one corner, a half-collapsed arch provided an exit to the interior yard, where the walls still stood tall. A couple of battered soldiers rushed forward to help them navigate the rubble. One recognized Daenerys and faltered, a look of sorrow flickering across his face, as if the memory of her as a living queen clashed with the dreadful sight before him. But he stayed silent, simply assisting with a firm nod. At last they reached the great hall's entrance, where one wooden door had been ripped from its hinges. The interior bore signs of the recent fight. Frost caked the floors, some furniture was overturned, and the windows on one side were shattered. Yet the stone walls had held, providing an area of relative shelter from the killing wind. Torches sputtered in brackets along the walls, their flames giving the hall a dim, flickering glow. The precious heat they produced felt like a gift from the gods. A cluster of survivors had begun gathering there, northern soldiers, Vale archers, Ironborn who'd arrived in that timely charge. Some tended the wounded. Others carefully laid out the bodies of those who hadn't made it. A hush settled over the crowd when Jon entered. They saw Daenerys' body, her hair stiff with ice, and realized what must have happened. Several lowered their heads. A few clenched their fists at their sides, remembering the living queen who had once, if briefly, been their ally. Yet her final form was too terrifying to dwell on, so they turned their attention to triage, focusing on the present crisis. Grey Worm stood near the center of the hall, his polished helmet off. The scar on his face was pronounced in the flickering firelight. He was battered, the left side of his armor dented, but still upright, his expression stoic. A handful of Unsullied were with him, fewer than the proud columns that had marched into Winterfell in ages past. Their numbers had been whittled away by the combined tragedies of these wars, and tonight had stolen many more. Grey Worm's gaze fixed upon Daenerys' corpse in Jon's arms, and something in him seemed to break. His stoic mask shattered. He let out a ragged, breathless exhale, though no tears came. His training would not allow him tears, but the depth of his anguish was plain to see. Jon paused in front of Grey Worm. Words wouldn't come. There was too much heartbreak, too much regret. Finally, Grey Worm's voice rose, hoarse and trembling. She was our queen. He stared at Daenerys' face. We failed her. Jon shook his head, eyes brimming with grief. She saved all of us in her own way, at the end. Whatever else happened, that last flicker of her will helped me kill the Night King. Without her, he couldn't finish. Grey Worm's eyes shone with a fury born of mourning. For a moment, Jon feared he would lash out, perhaps blame him. After all, Jon had once taken Daenerys' life in King's Landing, by necessity, or so history recounted. Now he'd done so again, in a manner of speaking. But Grey Worm seemed to swallow that anger, letting it coil somewhere in his chest. He inclined his head and turned, gesturing to a cleared space along the far wall. "Lay her there," he said softly. "We will stand guard, and later, there will be rites, the Targaryen way." Jon silently carried Daenerys to the designated spot, where others had begun placing bodies of the highest importance, or those who had fallen in crucial moments. Tyrion sat hunched beside a still form under a cloak, presumably a beloved comrade or soldier from the battle. When he noticed Jon approaching with Daenerys, Tyrion's mismatched eyes went wide. It was the first time he had laid eyes upon his queen in this state. Gods! He stood, unsteadily, almost toppling. Someone had hastily wrapped a bandage around his temple, where dried blood clung to his hair. He took a step closer, parted his lips as if to speak, but no words emerged. Perhaps all he could manage was a hoarse, pained sound, for he too understood the magnitude of this final loss. Arya managed to slip away to find a makeshift cot where a healer or maester's assistant could tend her wounds. Jon knelt once more and lowered Daenerys' body onto a thick blanket. Grey Worm stood sentinel. Jon pressed her hands against her chest, arranging them as if in a gesture of repose, though her skin was stiff. Some of the black fluid from her wound had crystallized, leaving an unnatural stain across her front. Jon removed what ragged bits of the harness and straps still clung to her body. Relics from the undead saddle the Night King had forced upon her. He pulled them aside, as if removing hateful chains. Then, with a trembling exhale, he sat back on his heels, staring at her face. Tyrion knelt as well, crossing his arms over his small chest, though his shoulders sagged with fatigue. "The last time I saw her body," She was spirited away by Drogon, beyond my sight. Now I see her again, and I find no words." He shook his head. "If there are gods, they have a cruel sense of humor." Jon closed his eyes. He recalled that day in King's Landing, how Drogon had carried Daenerys' body away. The memory twisted painfully in his chest. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," he murmured, though the words felt useless. "We tried to stop the White Walkers. We thought we had. And then she was brought back against her will." "Mawanish." Tyrion's gaze slid to Grey Worm. "We will see that she is laid to rest with dignity. I swear that on my life." His voice carried a surprising firmness. Then to Jon he added softly, "We'll need you, Jon, for what comes next. As King Bran's envoy, or as a leader among the North, or simply as yourself, people will look to you." Jon felt the weight of that. "I'm no lord. I'm no king. I've never wanted power." Grey Worm didn't shift his gaze from Daenerys. She wanted to break the wheel. She wanted a better world. "You were the one who ended her life. Twice." His voice held no open accusation, only a dull sense of finality. "All that's left is the living. Decide if you will build that better world, or if you'll keep letting it slip from your hands." Jon lowered his head. He was too exhausted to argue, too heartsick to muster a response. The warmth from the torches and braziers in the hall made his limbs tingle, painfully thawing stiff muscles. All he knew was that the realm still needed them. To bury the dead, to rebuild, to comfort the survivors. Beyond that, the future remained an uncharted wilderness. He forced himself to his feet and turned away from Daenerys' body. If he stayed, he'd collapse in despair. Better to see to what must be done. Tyrion followed him, limping slightly. Together they surveyed the great hall, taking stock of how many were wounded, how many needed immediate aid, and how much of the castle's supplies remained. Sansa was near the far end, speaking with a cluster of northern soldiers. Her face was drawn and pale, her lower lip cracked from the cold, but she stood tall, her voice carrying authority even in the midst of heartbreak. When Sansa finished her conversation, she turned and caught Jon's eye. He walked to her with slow, deliberate steps. For a moment, they regarded one another in silence. A swirl of unspoken emotion passed between them. Relief that they both lived, sorrow for all that had been lost, and the question of how they would ever rebuild. "Is Arya safe?" Sansa asked, noticing the blood on Jon's armor. "She was hurt. I saw her on Drogon's back. I still can't believe what I witnessed." "She's in the corner over there," Jon answered, nodding toward a row of cots. "She'll live, I think, but she's wounded badly. The same spear that nearly ended her life was the one she forced into Daenerys' chest. If she hadn't done that, we might all be—" His voice broke off. "It's over." Sansa shut her eyes, a tremor in her slender frame. "We have to see that she gets proper care. But the Maester's wing is half crumbled. We'll have to see if any portion remains intact. If not, we'll improvise. And we need to check the crypts. Some of our people sheltered there." A flicker of fear crossed her face. "We all remember what happened last time. Let's hope the Night King didn't have enough time to raise more of the dead from beneath our feet." Jon ground his teeth. "I'll gather a party to go check. We should do it carefully. Some parts of the castle structure might be compromised." He turned as a soldier with a braided beard approached. The man carried a battered shield bearing House Mormont's sigil. The soldier saluted, chest heaving. "My lord, the main courtyard has stabilized, but the walls are near collapse. We found survivors pinned under rubble. They could use more hands clearing it. And the gatehouse is destroyed. We'll need to find or build a new route for wagons to come in with supplies." Jon nodded. "Organize the able-bodied. Start clearing the rubble. We'll do a head count of who's left. Make sure you bring torches. There are deep pockets of ice. Stay cautious." The soldier saluted again and rushed off. Tyrion leaned wearily against a pillar. "The storm has let up some," he said. "We should send riders to any nearby holdfasts that might have survived. We'll need food, medicine, warm clothing, fresh horses. The winter is still here, though perhaps we've defeated the darkest part of it. Now, Sansa, her hands clasped, exhaled. I'll see who's willing to go. They'll have to ride carefully. The roads will be treacherous. She paused. Jon, if you speak to Grey Worm or the Unsullied, see if they'll help us with the dead. We must separate the living from the lost. Then perhaps we can build a funeral pyre for those we can't bury. Jon gave a bleak nod. The images of pyres stacked with corpses flickered in his mind. A memory from the last great war. Now they would do it all over again. Only this time, Daenerys Targaryen would lie among them. The final Targaryen, he thought, or nearly so. Ghosts of the past haunted him. Aegon the Conqueror, the Mad King, Rhaegar Targaryen, all culminating in the silver-haired queen who had soared on the wings of dragons, only to die twice for a realm that never truly embraced her. He swallowed down the knot of grief. Duties first. Morning could come later. They set to work. Hours bled together. The dawn brightened into a thin gray daylight, revealing the extent of the damage to Winterfell. Entire sections of the outer battlements lay in rubble, and in some places the courtyard was a sheet of glittering ice, thick enough to bury men's boots. Frozen corpses, both whites and living defenders who hadn't survived, were lifted onto crude sleds to be transported into a separate area for identification. Jon supervised teams of men who chipped through the ice to free those pinned underneath. Shouts carried in the brittle air as they dug out survivors or offered quiet condolences to the families who discovered the worst. Amid this grim labor, an unexpected group emerged from the western gate. Yara Greyjoy and her Ironborn, who had led the flanking maneuver. Their faces were still flush with adrenaline. They'd retreated after the final wave of fighting died down, securing the perimeter to ensure no more undead lurked about. Now Yara strode across the courtyard with an air of subdued pride. Her black leathers were battered, her dark hair plastered to her brow by sweat, yet her eyes gleamed with a glint of fierce satisfaction at having survived. Jon paused to greet her. She eyed him up and down. You look like hell, Snow. Jon, too exhausted for courtesy, merely nodded. Thank you for coming, he said. You arrived when we had nearly lost everything. She set her hands on her hips, surveying the ruin. You had it far worse than I realized, didn't you? My scouts saw whites rampaging across your outer fields in numbers we thought impossible. By the time we got here, they were nearly at your doorstep. She hesitated, glancing around. But it seems the threat is ended. Jon met her gaze. The Night King is dead. Truly dead this time. Yara arched a brow. And the Dragon Queen? For a moment, Jon couldn't speak. The memory of her lifeless form weighed on him. She's gone, he managed. She was enslaved by the Night King, turned into something monstrous. In the end, we freed her from it. Yara's gaze flicked across the courtyard. Hard to imagine that woman ever bowing to anyone. Then again, I once told her I'd follow her if she would free my people. She tried to. The Ironborn captain turned her face slightly away. She was no friend of Euron's, and that's good enough for me. I wish it could have ended differently. But we'll stay on for a time, help you rebuild. There's no point sailing home to the Iron Islands while winter blocks most of our seas with ice. Jon gave her a tight nod, grateful for any aid. I appreciate it. We need every able hand. If you have healers in your party, we're short on them. The wounded are in the Great Hall. Maberwawineni. Yara signaled to a handful of her men, who split off and headed inside. She drew closer to Jon, her voice quieter. The men are asking about what's next, who rules all that. We have a crippled realm, and no clear answer. King Bran was on the throne, but he's leagues away, isn't he? Jon raked a hand through his hair, which was stiff with frost. Yes. He went south on royal business, forging alliances. We have no ravens to contact him. We'll likely send riders once the roads are safe. Until then, we hold Winterfell in trust for the crown. Nat. Yara studied him. I recall you had no taste for crowns, but if the realm should need a figurehead. He set his jaw. I will do my duty, as I always have. But I have no ambition. He sighed, scanning the courtyard. If Sansa can hold the North together, that might suffice. The realm might look to King Bran for decisions, but the North needs a leader. Winterfell needs a caretaker. She was born for it, in a way. Or Arya, if she'd accept it. He shook his head, remembering how fiercely Arya guarded her freedom. But I suspect she won't. She's never been the lady of anything. Sansa is the one the North trusts. Yara nodded. We'll see how it pans out. She gestured toward the broken battlements. I'll have my men start reinforcing those, if you can spare some resources. We know a bit about patching holes in walls. With a final brisk nod, she made her way to direct her Ironborn. Jon continued onward, directing some of the Mormont and Glover men to gather leftover dragonglass weapons. Spears, arrows, swords, just in case any pockets of the dead still roamed. He also insisted on a thorough search of the crypts. The last thing they needed was more undead Starks clawing their way up from the depths. By midday, the winter sun rose above the horizon, glaring and cold, illuminating the castle in an uncomfortably stark light. Blood on the snow looked black. The air smelled of smoke and open wounds. Cries of pain echoed from the hall, where the wounded received rudimentary care. Now and again, Jon's gaze drifted to the part of the hall where Daenerys' body rested. Grey Worm remained at her side, sometimes kneeling with his head bowed, sometimes standing sentry. A handful of Unsullied took turns relieving him, but Grey Worm kept returning. Watching that vigil, Jon felt a pang of guilt so sharp it cut him anew. Despite everything, Grey Worm had followed Daenerys across the seas, had fought for her vision of a broken wheel. Her story had ended in an impossible tragedy, leaving him and so many others adrift. At one point, when Jon returned to the hall to check on Arya, he found Grey Worm upright, face as hard as granite, staring down at Daenerys' body. A cloak was now draped over her, but her pale arms remained visible, folded over her chest. The black stain around her chest wound had turned dull, no longer shimmering with any leftover magic. Jon approached quietly. "She will have a pyre," Grey Worm said without looking up. "That is the Targaryen custom. Fire for the dragon's daughter." Jon swallowed, nodding. Yes, that was how we said farewell to her when she fell in King's Landing, though Drogon carried her away before we could finish. Now, he trailed off, because it felt ghoulish to talk about it as if it were just a ritual. But it was the right thing to do. Grey Worm shifted his gaze to Jon. The anger he felt was still there, behind his eyes, but it was tempered now by heartbreak. "Let me see it done. I will gather wood. You will help me." Jon didn't hesitate. He studied the battered hall. "We'll need a place to build a pyre, somewhere large enough, out of the wind. But His breath caught, and he forced himself to continue. "I'd like to say my farewells, if you wish it." Grey Worm's shoulders stiffened. For a moment, he looked as though he might refuse. Perhaps he still blamed Jon for everything. Then his expression cracked, just slightly. "She would have wanted it," he murmured. "You two fought side by side. You—" He paused, searching for words. "You knew her as well as any could." Jon felt tears threaten to form, but the dryness of his eyes stung. He had no tears left. Sorrow had carved him hollow. "Thank you." He forced himself away, heading to the cots at the back of the hall to check on Arya. He found her propped on a low wooden bench, while a man with the red maester's chain rummaged through jars and bandages. The real maester of Winterfell was nowhere to be found, likely in the field or lost in the chaos. This man was an assistant or an older maester from some lesser holdfast who'd been traveling. Regardless, he was working diligently to stitch Arya's side. Arya's face was pale, sheen of sweat glistening on her brow, but her jaw was clenched in stoic silence. "How is it?" Jon asked softly, kneeling beside her. He reached for her hand, and she squeezed his fingers with surprising strength. "I'm fine," Arya said, gritting her teeth. "Hurts like the seven hells, but I'll keep breathing." The makeshift maester gave a nod of agreement. "She's strong. The wound's deep but clean. I've stitched it. Once she rests, she should recover. If infection doesn't set in, He gave Jon a somber glance. "Keep her warm. Keep her still if you can." Arya scowled. "I've never been good at sitting still." But she thanked the man all the same, in her blunt way. Jon placed a hand on her brow, brushing aside a few stray locks of hair. "Thank you," he said to the maester, and then lowered his voice as he addressed Arya. "Rest as best you can. The fighting's over. You did more than enough." He recalled how she'd braved the impossible jump onto Drogon, how she had plunged that spear into Daenerys. Twice now, she had saved them all from the Night King's power. The memory churned his stomach with complicated gratitude and sorrow. Arya's gray eyes flickered. "Someone had to," she whispered. She glanced across the hall to where Daenerys lay. "I'm sorry, Jon." He closed his eyes, took a slow breath. "It's done. She's at peace now." Arya's lips set in a hard line, as if she were unsure that peace was the right word. But she let him help her lie back, wincing, an arm pressed to her bandaged side. Jon took a moment to ensure she had a blanket, then rose, stepping away. A swirling sense of numbness hollowed him out. Whenever he paused to think, the pain threatened to swallow him. Time wore on. In the early afternoon, the first wave of corpses, those recognized and claimed, were moved to a separate courtyard where funeral pyres would be constructed in staggered lines. Crews gathered wood from the storerooms. The meager supply forced them to dismantle broken furniture and scavenge half-frozen timbers. Soldiers hammered stakes into the ground to erect a small windbreak of canvas, enough to keep the pyres from extinguishing in the swirling gusts that still scoured the courtyard. Grey Worm supervised the special pyre for Daenerys, set at the highest point near the old hearth in the Godswood clearing, for that was the only area not completely choked with rubble. He wanted Daenerys to rest near the heart tree, as though in some intangible way, the old gods might bear witness. Jon wondered what the queen would have thought about being laid to rest under the ancient red leaves of a northern heart tree. Perhaps she would have found it ironic, or perhaps she would have welcomed it. She'd once tried so hard to earn the North's respect. When they were ready, 4 of the Unsullied carefully bore Daenerys' body from the hall. They had wrapped her in a white linen shroud, but her face remained visible, the pale features looking less monstrous now, cleansed of the icy corruption. Jon walked beside them, silent, flanked by Tyrion and Grey Worm. A small procession followed, mostly Unsullied and Northern soldiers, plus Sansa and Arya, the latter walking with a limp, refusing to be left behind. Tormund lingered near the rear, arms folded over his chest, deferring to the ones who had known Daenerys better. They reached the Godswood. The pool was partially frozen, the weirwood's branches coated in frost, the red leaves dusted with white. It was a solemn, haunting beauty, the kind that made men think of ancient spirits. At the center of a cleared patch, wood was stacked waist-high, forming a rough pyramid. Each log glistened with frost that had to be knocked away before it could catch a flame. They laid Daenerys on top, carefully arranging her so that she lay facing upward, arms folded across her chest. Jon took a moment to place her hands gently, ensuring the shroud did not pull away from her features. The hush deepened. Grey Worm, standing at the base of the pyre, took a torch from one of his men. He stared at the flickering flame, the golden reflection dancing in his dark eyes. Jon wondered what memories raced through his mind. The liberation of Slaver's Bay, Missandeia's bright laughter, Daenerys standing tall on the prow of a ship, vowing to break the chains of the world. Now all of it reduced to a battered queen on a funeral pyre. Grey Worm lifted the torch. "To the Dragon Queen," he said, voice wavering. The Unsullied repeated the phrase in Valyrian. Their chant rose in unison, subdued but resonant. Amhisa. Misa. A word that once meant mother. A memory of a time she had been adored for her mercy, for her flame that burned away cruelty. Then Grey Worm touched the torch to the wooden timbers around the base of the pyre. The flames licked hungrily at the pitch-soaked logs. In moments, fire crackled, climbing upward. Jon felt the searing heat on his face. It was a powerful reminder of the dragon flame that had once been Daenerys' greatest ally. He stared up at her still form as the orange glow lit her features. Arya, beside him, reached out and gripped his hand. He squeezed back, eyes stinging from both smoke and tears he couldn't quite shed. They watched as the flames swelled, logs popping, releasing black smoke into the cold air. Slowly, the heat intensified, threatening to drive the watchers back. Yet most remained, bracing themselves against the scalding gusts. The edges of Daenerys' shroud caught fire first, curling like paper. Her silver hair, once frozen stiff, singed in a moment, the acrid smell stinging nostrils. Still, those who had followed her or loved her stood unwavering, paying their final respects. Jon felt an odd, terrible sense of closure. Daenerys had come into the world amidst fire and blood, and now she left it in fire once again. He stood there long enough that the heat became unbearable. His cheeks felt raw, and his eyes watered heavily. The form of Daenerys became obscured by the roaring flames. At last, Grey Worm fell to his knees, head bowed. Tyrion turned away, shoulders trembling, though tears might not have come. Sansa placed a gloved hand over her mouth, eyes shining. One by one, people stepped back, letting the conflagration burn. The wind changed direction, blowing sparks into the night sky, as though scattering fragments of her spirit among the stars. Jon turned to Arya, gently guiding her away before the smoke choked them. Together, they retreated to the heart tree, the bark's carved face seeming to weep red sap in the flickering light. Tormund waited there, eyes flicking between the funeral pyre and Jon. "We should do the same for the others," Tormund said quietly, gesturing beyond the godswood. "Many families want to bury their kin, but the ground's too frozen. The pyres are the only way." Jon nodded, voice hoarse. "We'll honor them all. I just needed to see her rest first." He gazed into the flames. The words she had said to him a lifetime ago haunted him. "We break the wheel, together." He shut his eyes, letting that memory fade into ash. As evening settled in, the fires continued to burn, and more pyres were lit throughout the courtyard to cremate the dead. The smell of smoke and burning flesh hung over Winterfell, mingling with the crisp tang of snow. There was no feast, no celebration of victory, only a grim acceptance that life had endured at horrific cost. Some men drank themselves into a stupor, ignoring the meager rations they still possessed. Others stood vigil, too hollowed by grief to speak. A few tried to find comfort in each other's arms, seeking warmth against the biting wind that crept through every crack in the stone. Jon found himself in the great hall again, staring at a table covered in hastily drawn plans and lists of supplies. Sansa was there, along with Tyrion, Davos, and Gendry, who looked haggard with soot smudged across his face. Arya was supposed to be resting, but she'd insisted on attending. She arrived last, pale but determined, leaning on a makeshift crutch. The flickering torches cast long, wavering shadows on the stone walls. Jon noted Grey Worm's absence. The unsullied commander lingered outside, near the still-burning remains of Daenerys' pyre. "We've accounted for most of the survivors," Davos said quietly, "though we still find a few in pockets of collapsed rubble. Our total fighting force is a fraction of what we had. Many houses lost their entire lines." He rubbed his forehead. "I've had men start burying or burning the white corpses outside the castle walls, so as not to foul the air in here. The cleanup alone will take days, if not weeks." Tyrion leaned over the table. "We have limited stores of food, not nearly enough to feed this many for long. We must either send people away or secure new provisions. Both are fraught with difficulty. The roads south are nearly impassable for large wagons, and we have no guarantee of friendly welcomes after the chaos of war." "Man?" Sansa pressed her lips together. "When we can, we should send riders to White Harbor, Last Hearth, the Dreadfort. Anywhere we can muster help. The Manderleys might supply ships to bring in goods from the south if the sea lanes aren't all frozen." She paused, a shadow crossing her expression. "We also need to retrieve King Bran, if he still lives. The realm must see that the monarchy stands. We can't govern in a vacuum." Jon listened, nodding slowly. "Then we dispatch ravens, if the rookery is still intact. If not, we send riders. Arya, how many can we spare?" Arya frowned. "A few. Even 1 or 2 riders might be enough, if they can slip through quietly." She swallowed. I'll go if you want me to. No, Sansa said firmly. You need to heal, and your presence is vital here. You saved us once from the Night King's hand. The people respect you. You can help keep order. Arya grimaced but didn't argue. Jon suspected she was too wounded to travel anyway. That spear had come dangerously close to finishing her off. We'll send willing scouts, he said at last. Let them know to find the king if they can. We'll do our best to maintain stability until he returns. Gendry, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. What about the Iron Throne? His blue eyes flicked to Sansa. If King Bran can't be found, or if something's happened to him, who rules? He looked uneasy at even asking, but the question was on everyone's mind. Sansa's gaze slid to Jon. We must pray we find Bran alive, she replied carefully. But if not, we'll have to convene a council. All the great houses that remain. We'll decide together. Benny? Tyrion let out a tired sigh. It feels like we just had that council, but so much has changed in so short a time. The realm can't bear constant upheaval. If it comes to it, I only hope the lords and ladies can put aside their ambitions long enough to see reason. Jon felt the weight of their eyes on him. The knowledge that he was still by blood a Targaryen, Aegon Targaryen, sixth of his name, hung in the air, unspoken. The secret had caused strife enough in the past. Now, with Daenerys gone, he was the last living link to the Targaryen line, aside from rumors of the scattered remnants across the sea. He closed his eyes, wishing none of it mattered. He wanted no part of the Iron Throne. He wanted only to bury his dead and find a quiet corner of the world. But the realm seldom allowed such luxuries. The meeting ended with a consensus to gather immediate resources: food, wood, and the meager medical supplies. They drafted a plan for how to systematically check each portion of Winterfell for survivors or structural weaknesses. Then each person drifted off to do whatever tasks fell to them. Sansa paused by Jon's side, placing a gentle hand on his arm. We'll manage, she said quietly. You're not alone in this. Jon nodded, and though he tried to form words of gratitude, none came. He simply clasped Sansa's hand in return, feeling the roughness of frost-chapped skin. The warmth of her presence, a small anchor against the dark tide of guilt and sorrow. She gave him a thin smile, then slipped away. That night, Jon found himself unable to rest. He wandered the corridors, past drifting smoke and the moans of the injured. Each corner evoked a memory. Here was where he had sparred with Robb as a boy. There was where he had once joked with Arya about her water dancing lessons. Here was the hall where Daenerys had first arrived, 1,000 lifetimes ago, and the tensions between queen and lady had overshadowed the hush of winter. Now these halls stood battered, the very stones groaning in the chill. Jon wondered if any place in the Seven Kingdoms would ever feel like home again. His feet carried him inevitably back to the Godswood. The great pyre had burned down to smoldering embers, though a subtle glow still pulsed beneath layers of ash. A faint haze of smoke drifted through the ancient trees. Grey Worm was there, half lit by the dying firelight. In the gloom, Jon saw the man's silhouette, shoulders rigid, helmet resting at his feet. He did not look up at Jon's approach. For several minutes, they stood in silence, listening to the crackle of cooling wood. Jon cleared his throat. I'm sorry, he said, voice thick. I know it doesn't mean much, but I'm sorry for everything that happened to her, from King's Landing to now. Grey Worm remained silent a moment. Then, without turning, he spoke. She believed in you even when others did not. She loved you. There was no accusation, only a raw ache. What did it matter? In the end, she was alone in the dark. He raised his head, looking at the faint stars through the branches. Missandei is gone. Daenerys is gone. Everything I believed in. Was it all for nothing? Jon felt the question cut him to the quick. No, he said quietly. She changed the world. Maybe not as she intended, but she freed thousands of slaves. She brought dragons back into the world. She united the realm against the dead, twice. That has to mean something. Demon. Grey Worm's hands curled into fists. It does not bring her back. Jon had no answer to that. I wish I could change the past, but I can't. They stood like that for a time, letting the godswood's hush envelop them. Then Grey Worm stooped, lifting his helmet. We will leave this place soon, he said, voice subdued. The Unsullied are not meant to guard a castle. We have no queen. Many have died. Those who remain are free to choose where they go. Some may wish to sail for Neath, as Missandei once wished. Others may stay in Westeros. I have no command for them now. Nemo Santi. Jon blinked in surprise. But we need your help. Rebuilding. Keeping order. The realm. Grey Worm cut him off with a quiet but firm tone. We have served enough kings and queens. The Unsullied are an army made for war. And our war is done. Perhaps we will remain a little while, out of respect for Daenerys, but not forever. Our fate is our own now. Jon nodded, a mix of regret and understanding. If you choose to leave, you'll go with our gratitude. Nothing can repay what your people have given. Grey Worm's only response was a curt nod. Then he turned and walked away, footsteps crunching through the thin snow. His figure receded into the gloom. Jon found himself alone, gazing at the blackened remains of the pyre. At last, he sank to his knees, the heat from the embers warming his face while the night air pressed cold against his back. He bowed his head, letting the swirl of sorrow pass over him. Perhaps he prayed, though he wasn't sure to whom. Maybe to the old gods, maybe to the mother of dragons herself, or maybe to the memory of the realm he had once believed in. In the days that followed, the cleanup intensified. Teams scoured the countryside around Winterfell to gather the remains of whites and ensure no pockets of undead roamed free. Word began to spread throughout the north that the threat was defeated. Some minor lords and their retinues trickled in, bringing meager supplies and heartfelt thanks. The immediate crisis of the White Walkers was over, but the struggle to survive the long winter had only begun. Between organizing supply runs, checking on the wounded, and working with Sansa to maintain order, Jon had little time for reflection. Yet at night, dreams plagued him. Visions of Daenerys beckoning from beyond a veil of snow, or the Night King's cold eyes glaring through a swirl of black wings. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart hammering, haunted by the memory of plunging Longclaw into that icy visage, Daenerys' final shriek echoing in his ears. Sansa proved an able leader, as Jon knew she would. She coordinated with the local lords, insisted on fair distribution of whatever meager resources they had, and comforted grieving families with a calm, empathetic presence. In the Great Hall, she listened to every petitioner, from highborn to commoner, ensuring that no one starved while others hoarded. She had grown into the role of Lady of Winterfell, with a quiet resolve that reminded Jon of their mother, Catelyn Stark, though Sansa's trials had hardened her in ways their mother had never known. Arya's strength returned slowly. She still winced when moving her left side, and the wound ached in the cold. But she refused to remain idle. Jon often found her in the courtyard, watching the ironborn laborers patch the walls. Sometimes she would practice swordplay with her weaker hand, ignoring the protests of the maester's assistant, who warned her she was straining her stitches. Her expression was distant, as though some part of her yearned for the open road. But for now, she stayed, perhaps knowing she was needed, or perhaps uncertain where else to go. Tyrion spent much of his time in conversation with Sansa and Davos, hashing out survival strategies. Sometimes he took a walk along the partial battlements, sipping from a small flask of wine, lost in thought. Jon spoke with him once or twice, finding the Lannisters' cynical wit surprisingly subdued. Tyrion too had lost a queen, and though his relationship with Daenerys had been fraught at the end, he had never truly stopped caring. When Jon brought up the possibility of Tyrion reclaiming some political position, Master of Coin or something akin to Hand of the King, Tyrion shrugged and said, "I don't think I'm fit for that anymore, but we'll see what King Bran says, if he's still alive." There was no humor in his tone. About a week after the battle, With Winterfell's defenses somewhat stabilized, Jon realized they had to confirm King Bran's fate. They had no living ravens. They'd all frozen or starved in the chaos. So riders had been sent in various directions, but none had returned yet. Fear gnawed at Jon. What if the Night King's resurgence had reached south in some manner? Or what if the realm was fracturing again, leaving them vulnerable? He resolved to send more riders, this time with better supplies. Yara Greyjoy volunteered a few of her best scouts, men who had once served as reavers but were adept at traveling swiftly. They set off, promising to find word of King Bran. Meanwhile, the Unsullied began to depart. One morning, Grey Worm approached to Jon in the courtyard, where fresh snow lay over half-cleared rubble. The commander wore his full armor, but the silver Targaryen sigil had been scraped away, leaving only the plain steel. "We sail for Anoth," he said without preamble. "Missandei wanted to go home. I will see her ashes there, or as close to it as I can manage." Jon nodded. He extended a hand, in a gesture of respect. "Then go with peace. I can't thank you enough for what you've done. You helped us defeat the dead twice over." Grey Worm hesitated before clasping Jon's forearm in a warrior's shake. "We owed Daenerys our lives. We repaid that debt. Now we are free." There was no malice in his voice, only finality. "Many Unsullied have chosen to follow me. Some remain, perhaps to seek a different life, but we will trouble you no longer." Jon lowered his gaze. "There is ever anything we can do?" "There is nothing." Grey Worm released Jon's arm. "Farewell, Jon Snow." Without waiting for a further reply, he turned and strode away, boots crunching on snow. Outside the gate, a thin line of Unsullied marched in disciplined formation, carrying what gear they could salvage. A few battered wagons and horses had been provided by Winterfell's stables. They would travel south, likely to find ships in White Harbor or beyond, and then sail for Essos. Jon watched them go with a heavy heart. It felt like the final severing of Daenerys' legacy. He wondered if the stories told in Essos would remember her as a liberator or a doomed conqueror. Perhaps both. The last glimpse he caught was Grey Worm's erect posture at the head of the column. Then they disappeared over the snowy horizon. Days passed. The pyres had cooled to ash long ago, and the halls of Winterfell were reoriented to daily survival. People huddled around hearths at night, sharing stories or haunting silences. Even with the living threat gone, the ravages of war lingered. Frostbite, hunger, infection. All these new enemies replaced the old. But at least the wind felt less hostile. The sky no longer churned with that unholy swirl of dark magic. They had a chance, however slim, to rebuild. One gray afternoon, as Jon supervised a group hauling timber to patch the main gate, a horn sounded beyond the walls. The watchers on the ramparts shouted a warning. Then a moment later, the horn changed note. An announcement of arriving allies, not foes. Jon hurried to see who had come. The battered gates yawned open, letting in a ragged column of riders carrying several flags. The direwolf of House Stark, the trout of House Tully, the moon and falcon of the Vale. At their head rode King Bran Stark himself, seated in a specially constructed wheeled platform attached to a strong horse's harness. Beside him, the tall form of Brienne of Tarth guided her destrier. A line of knights in half-frozen cloaks followed. Jon's heart soared with relief. He rushed forward, stepping through half-cleared snow, ignoring the burn in his thighs. Sansa appeared at his side, breath catching at the sight of her younger brother. The riders halted in the courtyard. Bran, serene yet weary, gazed upon the ruins of Winterfell with eyes that were both ancient and sorrowful. "Jon," he said, voice soft. "Sansa." His hair had grown longer, pale brown locks framing that distant face. Something in him seemed older still, as if traveling had only deepened his otherworldly aura. "You're alive," Jon breathed, stepping up to the horse. He reached for Bran's hand, gripping it in his own. "We feared the worst." The Night King returned, Bran. He brought Daenerys back with him. It was unthinkable." Bran closed his eyes briefly, as though a wave of sadness washed over him. I saw fragments, he said, cryptic as ever. But I was far away, forging an alliance in the Riverlands, and by the time I sensed the danger, it was nearly too late. We hurried back as fast as we could. He let out a faint sigh. Is he gone? Sansa nodded, swallowing hard. For good this time, we hope. Arya and Jon killed him again. Daenerys too is truly gone. She was turned, Bran. She. Sansa's voice wavered. She saved us in the end, or part of her did. Bran's pale eyes flickered. The Dragon Queen has found her final rest. May she find peace in whatever realm awaits her soul. Then he glanced around. And Winterfell has paid dearly once more. Jon felt the exhaustion of the last weeks bear down on him anew. We lost many. Half the castle is in ruins. We used what little we had to cremate the dead. Others are scattered or fled. The roads are blocked. We've done our best to keep order, but the realm is still fractured, Bran finished. He raised a hand as if to forestall further explanation. We'll handle this. First, let's see to the immediate concerns. We have some supplies with us, not much, but enough to help. Then we'll decide how to proceed. They moved Bran inside, clearing a path through the corridor. Arya joined them, throwing her arms around Bran in a brief, tight embrace. She winced from her still-healing wound, but refused to let go quickly. Bran stroked her hair with one gentle hand, as if comforting a child, though his own expression was distant. Brienne stood respectfully to the side, though relief radiated from her tall frame. She had sworn a vow to protect Bran, and evidently she had kept it. In the great hall, a meeting was convened. Bran listened, while Jon, Sansa, Tyrion, Davos, and others relayed the story of the renewed threat, the siege of Winterfell, the final confrontation with the Night King and the undead Daenerys. Bran's face remained impassive, but occasionally a flicker of sorrow crossed it, as if he were seeing everything again in the endless tapestry of his greensight. When they reached the part about Daenerys' final pyre in the Godswood, he bowed his head for a moment, eyes closing. Her destiny was always entwined with the realm, Bran said softly at last. Perhaps this was the last note in that song. A tragic chord that had to be struck. Tyrion, shoulders tense, exhaled. If so, the entire realm is left reeling. We have lost half our forces. The south is in flux, and with winter closing off much of the land, we can't easily reassert stability. Nemtro. Bran turned his gaze to Jon. You led them here, Jon, to save Winterfell. You ended the Night King's threat a second time. I sense you're burdened by guilt, but do not be. You did what you had to do. Jon studied the table. Perhaps. But it cost us her life. Again. Sansa gently reached out and placed a hand on Jon's arm. And saved everyone else. If that's not worth the cost, I don't know what is. She turned to Bran. We will need your authority, your wisdom. The houses will rally behind you as king if you call your banners. But resources are scarce. Even with the dead gone, we face a dire winter. Bran nodded. We'll do what we must. First, we secure the north. Then, we send ravens to the south, calling for unity in the face of crisis. We'll request shipments of grain, livestock, anything that can pass the neck. I'll use what influence I can muster to see that it happens. Tyrion folded his arms. And if the lords of the Reach or the Stormlands refuse, citing their own hardships? Bran's gaze was calm. Then we'll negotiate. Or I'll travel there myself when the roads permit. They might be more willing to help once they learn the Night King truly rose again, but has been permanently destroyed. The threat of the dead overshadowing them might inspire generosity. Estem nodded. Jon wondered if it would be so easy. The memory of Daenerys' approach to negotiation, dragons overhead, a posture of conquest, contrasted sharply with Bran's gentle authority. Perhaps that was what the realm needed now. A ruler who sought not to terrify but to unify, forging alliances with a quiet sense of inevitability. Jon dared to hope that a measure of peace might be possible, if only for a time. They spent the next hours detailing new plans. How to ration the supplies, how to distribute the fresh wagons Bran had brought, how to reorganize the remaining soldiers. Brienne contributed news from the south. King's Landing was still reeling from the destruction Daenerys had wrought in her final days, but a provisional council governed in Bran's stead, trying to repair the city. The Lords of the Reach had pulled back to Highgarden, uncertain if they wanted to bend the knee or carve their own domain. The Vale was more loyal, sending smaller parties to assist. Dorne remained quiet, as it often did when winters were harsh. They might re-emerge in spring, or not at all. By the meeting's end, they had a workable plan for the next few weeks. They would hold Winterfell as the center of authority in the north, gather the scattered lords, and ensure no pockets of the dead remained. Meanwhile, more riders would go south to spread word of the Night King's final defeat and appeal for unity under King Bran. By the time the snows melted, a great council might be called in King's Landing, or perhaps here at Winterfell, to re-establish the realm's laws and lines of succession. Jon wondered if he could endure another such gathering, but it was necessary. After the council, Sansa declared a modest meal would be served. The great hall was too cold and damaged for a proper feast, but they lit fires, set up trestle tables, and brought out whatever could be spared. Bowls of hot broth, loaves of coarse bread, some salted fish, even a few barrels of ale. People sat wrapped in furs, hunched over bowls, trying to find a moment of respite in the gloom. The clink of spoons and the murmur of low conversation felt surreal after the catastrophic violence they had witnessed. Children huddled by their parents, eyes wide, uncertain if they were safe yet. Soldiers stared into their mugs, haunted by visions of the undead. Yet still, they lived, and so they ate. Jon sat beside Arya near one of the braziers, spooning broth with mechanical motions. Her color was a bit better, but her brow remained furrowed. She nudged him. "You're not eating?" she murmured. "Don't let yourself wither away." He gave her a thin smile, forcing down another mouthful. "I'm fine." Then, with a glance around, he lowered his voice. "I worry about what's next. The White Walkers are gone, for good, I hope. But does that mean we'll tear ourselves apart again? The great houses fighting for scraps?" Arya stared into the flickering coals. "Maybe. But we're stronger than before. We've seen the face of true darkness. Maybe that changes people." She shrugged, though a flicker of cynicism crossed her features. "Or maybe it doesn't. But we'll keep fighting. That's who we are." "No." Jon nodded, recalling how once she had told him she could survive anything, even after her time with the faceless man. Perhaps that was the lesson the North needed. Survival. They had endured the worst winter in memory, but spring would come eventually, and they would still be standing. Across the hall, Bran sat at the high table, hands folded. He didn't eat much. He never did these days, content with small portions. Sansa was by his side, quietly discussing logistical matters. Tyrion and Davos were further down, speaking in low tones about supply routes. Tormund was near the edge, regaling a few men with outlandish tales of giants and bears, though his usual boisterous laughter was subdued. The entire castle felt like it was tiptoeing through the aftermath of an earthquake. That evening, the temperature plummeted further, the night sky studded with stars. Jon retired to the same chamber he had once used, though half its windows were blown out. He set a small fire in the hearth and tried to lie down. Sleep toyed with him, offering fleeting moments of oblivion before dragging him back to half-waking dreams. He kept seeing Daenerys as she had appeared when she first arrived at Winterfell. Cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright. Then the image shifted to that undead visage, pale hair stiff with frost, glowing blue eyes. He jolted awake, breath ragged. In the quiet gloom, he rose and draped a cloak over his shoulders, deciding to walk off his restlessness. Ghost padded silently out of the shadows, pressing his muzzle into Jon's palm. The direwolf had roamed the castle, protective as ever, though he too bore scars from the final battle. His left ear was torn, and a faint limp marred his step, but he remained a loyal guardian. Jon stroked his fur, taking comfort in the simple warmth of an animal's companionship. They wandered the corridors, passing stray guards who saluted or murmured greetings. Eventually, Jon found himself at the top of the ramparts that overlooked the courtyard. The moon bathed the snow-covered ruins in silver light, giving the castle an otherworldly beauty. Smoke curled from a few hearths. Beyond the walls, the vast plains of the north stretched away, silent and still. Jon exhaled, letting the hush wash over him. He wondered what Daenerys would have done if she'd survived, truly returned to them. Would she have tried again to claim the throne? Or would she have been content to help rebuild, humbled by the horrors they had faced? He would never know. Part of him wanted to believe she could have found redemption, a place among them. Part of him remembered the fury in her eyes the day she burned King's Landing. Between those two parts lay an unbridgeable chasm that no future act could resolve. She was gone now, beyond blame or absolution. "Jon," came a soft voice from behind. He turned to see Sansa approaching, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak. She joined him at the parapet. Ghost sniffed her hand, tail wagging softly, and she gave him a fond pat. Then her gray eyes shifted to Jon. "Couldn't sleep either?" He shook his head. "No. Too many ghosts, I suppose." She nodded, gazing out over the courtyard. "I've been thinking about the days when we were children, before all of this. How Winterfell was so full of life. Music, feasts, the boisterous laughter in the yard. Now it feels like a half-buried tomb. I keep expecting father or mother to walk around a corner, but they never will." Jon reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're still here. That means something. That means we can bring life back to this place. It won't be the same, but it can be a home again." She swallowed, eyes misting. "Yes, we'll try." A faint breeze lifted strands of her auburn hair. "Bran wants to hold a ceremony soon, to honor those who fell, to reaffirm his rule and the loyalty of the northern houses. He asked if you would stand with him." Jon tensed slightly. "I will, if that's what he wants. But the North might not be so eager to accept me, especially now. There are rumors of my parentage, and, after Daenerys..." Sansa stepped closer, her expression firm. "You are a Stark in your heart. That's enough for the people who know you. And if any question arises about your Targaryen blood, remember, you saved them from the dead. Twice. They will not forget that. The North needs stability. You can provide it, alongside Bran." Jon sighed, looking down at the stony courtyard. "I never wanted to be a symbol. I never asked for any of this. Men don't know." She placed a hand against his cheek, turning his face to hers with gentle insistence. "None of us did, but here we stand, together." He allowed himself a small smile, gratitude warming him despite the cold. "Thank you, Sansa." Her faith in him steadied the swirling anxieties in his mind. She gave him a nod and then stepped back, arms folded in her cloak, gazing at the moonlit horizon. Jon turned his face to the night sky, letting the silence expand between them, finding in it a tentative hope. In the following days, small improvements revealed themselves. The weather, though still cold, stopped producing blizzards, granting a semblance of stillness. A few supply carts managed to arrive from the nearby towns, carrying salted meats and flour. Bran met with local lords who trickled into Winterfell, confirming their fealty and directing them to aid in repairs. The communal sense of purpose grew, forging a battered unity. To honor the fallen, Bran decreed a day of remembrance. It took place in the Godswood, where new pyres had been erected to burn any unclaimed bodies or those discovered in the rubble. Surviving families gathered, forming a circle around the ancient weirwood. Bran, flanked by Jon and Sansa, spoke words of tribute to the dead. He thanked the old gods, the new gods, any gods who might listen, for giving them victory against the undead. He asked for their guidance in the winter still to come. His voice was quiet, but carried strangely well in the frosty air, as though the old gods amplified his words. Afterwards, a hush fell as the final torches were placed against the pyres. The flames danced, reflecting off tear-streaked faces. Many sank to their knees, arms around each other, mourning openly now that they had time to do so. Jon stood beside Arya, who had her arms crossed, jaw set, tears glinting in her eyes that she refused to let fall. He slipped an arm around her shoulders. She let him, pressing her head briefly against him. Later that night, They returned to the hall, warmed by a flickering fire. Bran sat at the high seat, not quite a throne but close enough for the ceremony. He wore simple robes of dark gray. Sansa stood at his right, Arya and Jon at his left. Lords from the north and the Vale came forward, one by one, kneeling to reaffirm their loyalty. The words felt like echoes of an older time. I pledge my sword and my life to House Stark. Long live the king in the north, long live the memory of House Stark. But Bran was more than just the king in the north. He was the king of the Six Kingdoms, at least in name, if Dorne still held some measure of independence. The lords seemed uncertain how to greet him. Should they call him Your Grace or My Lord, King Bran, or Lord Stark? With typical calm, Bran simply accepted their oaths, not overly concerned about titles. That lack of pomp put them at ease, and the line moved smoothly. When they finished, Tyrion stepped forward with a dusty ledger. Your Grace, we must finalize the designations for the lords who fell. Many houses have no heir. He paused, looking around. If we do not assign new lords or confirm regents, we risk chaos. Bran nodded. Then let us do so. But carefully. Each house's traditions should be respected. Let those who hold the strongest claim come forward, and we'll see if they are suitable. And so the great hall settled into an impromptu session of governance. One after another, minor lords or knights approached to make their claims or ask for new lands. Bran, Sansa, and Tyrion deliberated with them, offering measured responses. Jon watched from the side, sometimes chiming in when asked about the individuals in question. Arya stood near him, stifling yawns, uninterested in the minutiae of inheritance law, but recognizing the necessity. It was a painstaking process. Winter's shadows lengthened, torches were lit, the night wore on. Yet people seemed relieved to engage in the simple, predictable rituals of governance, a far cry from the unnatural terrors that had so recently plagued them. Jon found himself thinking that Daenerys, for all her talk of breaking the wheel, had not truly embraced such patient bureaucracy. She had tried to shape the realm with fire and passion. Now, after her tragic end, it fell to Bran and Sansa to piece together the realm in slow, deliberate strokes. Perhaps that was how real change happened, not in the blaze of dragons, but in the quiet order of law and custom. At one point, a lord from the western edges of the north, a gaunt man with a clipped beard, stepped forward. Your Grace, what of the Targaryen claim now? With Queen Daenerys gone, do we revert entirely to the line of House Stark? He cast a wary glance at Jon. We hear rumors about certain parentages. Jon stiffened, expecting condemnation or challenge. But Bran merely tilted his head, expression calm. The realm has accepted me as king, chosen by a council of lords after the war. That remains so. Jon Snow is my kin, a Stark in truth and a Targaryen by blood, but he makes no claim to the throne. Let the realm know that we stand united under one banner. The lord bowed, satisfied. Jon exhaled, tension draining. He felt a flicker of gratitude toward Bran. In that moment, he understood that his best path, for now, was to support this quiet, all-seeing brother who held the fragile realm together through patient wisdom. Finally, the session concluded. Most people filed out to find rest or continue their tasks. Jon, Sansa, Arya, and Bran remained, slumping into chairs around the table. Tyrion lingered too, removing a sheaf of parchments he'd been scribbling on. They shared a moment of collective exhaustion, allowing themselves to breathe freely now that the formalities were done. It's a start, Bran said, voice distant. We have a long way to go, but seeds are planted. The realm can grow from this. In time. Sansa nodded, brushing a stray hair from her face. We need to bring the southern lords in line, and re-establish the court at King's Landing or here. We can't rule from two places at once, but we can't leave Winterfell so soon either. Neither war. We'll take it step by step, Bran replied. Then his gaze flicked to Jon. Brother, might I ask a favor of you? Jon frowned slightly. Of course. Davos is a skilled envoy, but he cannot be everywhere. Nor can Tyrion. I'd have you travel to the Riverlands on my behalf once the roads permit, to speak with the Tullys and the Freys, or what remains of them, and ensure their loyalty. Then proceed further south if needed, to open lines of trade that might bring more food north. Nantira. Jon paused, absorbing the request. Part of him balked at leaving Winterfell after all they'd been through. Another part recognized it was an important mission, one Daenerys herself might have undertaken in her old idealistic days. If that's what you need, I'll do it. But what about the north? Don't you need me here? Bran offered a faint smile. Sansa will handle matters in my name. She is more than capable. Arya is here as well. Winterfell will not be lacking in Starks. He glanced at Arya with a hint of amusement, but she only crossed her arms, giving a half smirk. Sansa nodded. We'll manage, but you'll have to wait until the snows ease. Travel now would be treacherous at best. Tyrion rubbed his chin. I suspect in a month or so, we might have a clearer path. The Riverlands are comparatively warmer, so the roads might open first there. Jon accepted it with a sense of resigned duty. Once more, the realm needed him to act as an intermediary, bridging gaps between the north and the rest of Westeros. Was that not the same role he had played so many times before, forging alliances, pleading with lords to see reason? Though he craved peace, he understood that achieving it often demanded restless effort. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Arya rose, stretching carefully, a hand pressed to her side. I think that's enough for tonight. I'm tired of talk, she said bluntly. No one argued. They dispersed, heading to what corners of Winterfell they called their own. Jon lingered a moment, meeting Bran's gaze. He saw a quiet understanding there, the same acceptance of fate that had marked Bran's transformation into the three-eyed raven. Perhaps none of them had chosen these paths, but they followed them anyway, bound by blood and necessity. As the weeks rolled on, the people of the north found a measure of routine again. The walls were shored up, new gates installed, the great hall repaired enough to host daily gatherings. The farmland around Winterfell remained under snow, so hunting parties scoured the woods for game, supplementing the limited supplies. Occasionally riders brought news from the south. House Tyrell's remnants were in disarray. House Baratheon was nearly extinct except for distant cousins, and Dorne's leadership remained quiet behind its deserts, waiting out the winter. Still, no new wars sprang up. For the first time in years, there was a strange lull in grand conflict. People were too exhausted to fight each other. They had seen the face of annihilation, and it had changed them. If the realm was not exactly united, it was at least not immediately fracturing. That, Jon thought, might be all they could hope for in the short term. One morning, Jon stood on the repaired battlements, gazing over the snow-laden fields. The sun was pale in the sky, but the air carried a hint of something gentler than deep winter's bite, as though the seasons might be turning, however gradually. Ghost sat beside him, ears perked. The direwolf had recovered well, though he still bore the scar across his ear. Voices stirred Jon from his reverie. Sansa and Arya walked up the stairway. They joined him at the wall, leaning on the parapet. For a moment, the three of them simply watched the horizon. It reminded Jon of childhood days, except that they were so changed, shaped by war and tragedy. We've come through so much, Sansa said softly. Sometimes I don't recognize the world we live in. Arya exhaled, a wry smile touching her lips. I certainly don't. But we're alive. That's no small thing. She glanced at Jon, then at Sansa. We have to be grateful for that, at least. Jon nodded. We do. The wind ruffled his hair. When I set out for the Riverlands in a few weeks, I'll make sure the lords understand what's happened here. That the North stands, that winter is not eternal. Maybe we can coax them to unify, if only so we don't starve each other. Sansa placed her hand on his. We'll be waiting for you to return. So will Winterfell. Arya smirked. We'll keep your seat warm if you ever decide you want one. She tapped the pommel of the dagger at her hip. Until then, I'll watch over these halls. If any trouble arises, I'll handle it. They shared a moment of familial warmth. Jon felt a swell of affection, remembering how once upon a time they had all been bickering children, each with their own dreams. Now those dreams had collided with the harshness of reality, forging unbreakable bonds. Whatever lay ahead, be it conflicts or slow rebuilding. They would face it as Starks, or as near to Starks as he could be. Jon turned his gaze south, letting his thoughts drift to Daenerys one last time. In some corner of his heart, he would always mourn the woman he'd loved, the queen who had soared on Dragonback to offer a better world, only to be consumed by tragedy. The echoes of her final stand would resonate in Westeros for generations. He murmured inwardly, "May you find peace wherever you are, Dany." But if the living were to honor her memory, or the memory of everyone lost in these wars, they had to keep going. Jon inhaled the crisp air, letting it fill his lungs with a bracing promise. Beyond the horizon, spring waited. And though the scars of winter might never fully vanish, new life would grow around them. He stood, joined by his sisters, on the walls of Winterfell, the seat of House Stark, battered yet unbowed. Far below, men and women worked to clear paths and repair houses, forging a fragile future. Overhead, the sun rose a fraction higher, a sign that the darkest hour had passed. They had weathered the storms of ice and death, lost so many, but had survived to shape the next chapter. And so, together, they faced the dawning day, uncertain but resolute, carrying the memory of the fallen queen and the victory over the Night King in their hearts. Each breath in that cold northern air felt like a testament to resilience, each heartbeat like a vow that they would not falter. Winter had come, and they had endured. Now, the time had come to rebuild, stone by stone, bond by bond, forging a realm that might at last know the value of peace. The future was unwritten, but it was theirs to claim, carved from the ashes and the ice left behind.